Hello everyone, my name is Dylan Frenz, and I'll be presenting the paper Preventing Lunchtime Attacks, Fighting Insider Threats with Eye Movement Biometrics. I will begin by first introducing the researchers of this paper. This is a collaborative project between Oxford, which is a university in the United Kingdom, and the Armasuisse, which is in Switzerland, and it is the Office for Defense Procurement, and it is a federal agency of the Swiss Confederation. From Oxford, we have Simon E. Bears, Casper B. Rasmussen, and Vincent Lenders. And from Armasuisse, we have Ivan Martinovich. I'll give a brief overview of this presentation as follows. I'll first go into the motivation and what this experiment is hoping to achieve, and then I'll take you into a deep dive into the related works and previous experiments that have been done in this field. And then we'll move on to the background about the human eye and eye tracking so you can better understand the experiments that are being done. And then I'll go into the setup of the experiment and the testing that is actually done. And finally, I'll go over the results and their applications. The purpose and motivation of the study is to research effective means of preventing lunchtime attacks. Lunchtime attacks refer to a person with physical access to a workstation that they are not supposed to use, such as using a coworker's workstation while they are away at lunch, or a cleaning person during after hours. In 2017, the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute released a report, The U.S. State of Software Cybercrime. Insiders were responsible for 35% of incidents of sensitive information leaking, 40% where customer records were compromised, 38% where employee records were compromised, and 33% where confidential records or trade secrets were compromised or stolen. And in 2011, a cybersecurity watch survey by Carnegie Mellon showed that 33% of attacks are committed by insiders, 60% of these attacks use a compromised account, and 43% of all those are performed locally using physical access to the workstation. Previous studies in biometrics include research into hard biometrics. Hard biometrics are metrics that are consistent throughout a person's life. They can't be changed, which makes them harder to mimic, but once breached, they are useless. An example of this is the attacks on iPhone's Touch ID, when copies of fingerprints have been shown to work in practical conditions. Mouse and keystrokes fall under the umbrella of behavioral biometrics, which are far less susceptible to replication attacks, but are more susceptible to false acceptance and rejection rates. Research began in the 1980s regarding studying for distinctive keystroke patterns. The error rates are low for static text, but for free-form text, they are much more unpredictable, and these tests are often tied to keyboard layout and devices. Another biometric that has been studied is the study of mouse movements. The false acceptance rate was 36% and false rejection rate 0%, but it was collected on the user's own PCs, which taints the report because it could just be detecting differences in devices. A study that is closely related to this paper used a gaze tracker to capture a subject's eyes during a movie. Their design requires a specific stimuli and as such cannot be used as a continuous form of authentication, as it is not task independent, and it does not evaluate the stability of this authentication over time. The human eye moves within 6 degrees of freedom with 6 muscles that can be split into 2 categories, saccades and fixations. Saccades are rapid stepwise movements of both eyes in the same direction that last anywhere between 10 to 100 milliseconds, depending on the distance covered. Fixations are focused, low-velocity eye movements with typical durations of 100 to 400 milliseconds. They are used to stabilize the retina over a stationary object of interest. The eyes are never truly still and may make involuntary movements even during fixations. The main reason for such movements is to counter retinal fatigue and prevent visual fading. One such movement is a microsaccade characterized by high velocity and acceleration away from a fixation center. Related to them are saccadic intrusions, which are involuntary movements away from the previous eye position, following a return with higher velocity and higher amplitude compared to a microsaccade. Traditionally, eye tracking has been relegated to the medical field for research into Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. This is due to their highly intrusive methods requiring a head-mounted device. But there has been advances in eye tracking technology in recent years that has been driven by advertising and human-computer interaction. This has brought us accurate, non-intrusive, video-based eye tracking, which focuses on pupils and records their movements and size. Eye tracking is defined as tracking the movements of the eyes and measuring their positions. If the eye positions are calibrated with respect to an external display, then the process is called gaze tracking. Choosing features is an important design consideration, as what data is required to compute them and whether there are any constraints regarding the environment which they are collected. It must only use raw eye tracking data and must be unaware of the applications or content of the screen. Task-independent features allow you to use the same training data with a task different to the one performed during the system's actual operation. This is highly desirable in offices, as when you work in an office you use a wide array of tasks such as emails or IMs. A high task independence will reduce the errors in the system. The features that the team chose are task independent and do not require a controlled stimuli. The main advantage to this is that experimental design is interchangeable and results are transferable over a wide variety of tasks. Pupil features can be split into static and dynamic features. Pupil range is largely consistent for each person and can be affected by physiology, gender, and ethnicity, and it will remain consistent through adulthood. The dynamic component is short-term changes of the pupil diameter. Static features are maximal, minimal, and mean pupil diameter and is observed during a fixation. The dynamic component is reflected by the short-term changes of the pupil diameter. These can be caused by cognitive load or different lighting. While they are equal for each person, their reactions to them may not be. They model these changes through the standard deviation and the difference between the minimal and maximal pupil diameter observed during a fixation. If you look at this table, it shows all the features that the teams modeled and their RMIs. Temporal features include both the duration of saccades and fixations as well as speed and acceleration. Both the peak and average velocity of movements within a fixation have been shown to differ greatly between people in related neuroscientific work. These differences work through saccadic intrusions and microsaccades. These features have a high degree of task independence, which makes them desirable for this experiment. Different studies report similar ranges for these values, even though their experiments differed significantly. They computed the velocity between each pair of consecutive samples and only used the magnitude of acceleration. The reason being is that it is task independent as the direction depends on the location of the target stimulus. Spatial features measure the steadiness of a person's gaze. A fixation is a group of samples within a fixed size circle. The total area that can be covered by a fixation is limited by this definition. If a person's gaze is steady, the samples will be clustered closely around a fixation center, with a few samples outside this group. If a person has trouble focusing their gaze, the samples will be spread more evenly. They compute the difference between each raw sample and the center point, as well as the distance between each raw sample. These movements may be more pronounced in the vertical or horizontal direction, and they also make the distinction. The distance between two fixations allowed them to measure how many points between the two areas of interest are actively focused and processed by the subject. The saccade direction measured in degrees allows a distinction between stepwise and more diagonal eye movements. Having a measure of feature quality is important for two reasons: to select the best features and to gain better insights to why a biometric works. Initially, uncertainty is assigned to each user ID. Each feature that reveals an amount of information about this user ID can be measured through mutual information. To measure the mutual information relative to the entire amount of uncertainty, they use relative mutual information, which measures the percentage of entropy that is removed from the user ID when a feature is known. The RMI is defined as the equation that is shown. In order to calculate the entropy of a feature, it has to be discrete. As most features are continuous, they perform a discretization using an equal width discretization algorithm with 20 bins. In order to reduce the effects of outliers, they use the first and 99th percentiles instead of minimal and maximal values. A high RMI indicates that it is distinctive on its own, but it is important to consider features that have a high correlation when choosing a feature set. When selecting which features candidates should form the final feature set regarding several aspects that need to be considered. Hard to imitate and restricting anything that can be observed and copied. It might be possible for a sophisticated attacker to modify their own pupils, and you must be able to address this. High-dimensional feature sets will slow classification and cause higher resource consumption. If the feature redundancy is high or many non-distinctive features are included in the original set, feature selection is particularly useful. And this figure shown shows the correlation between features belonging to the same group is relatively high while intergroup is lower. This suggests that all three groups contribute to the distinctiveness of the biometric and no group can be replaced by the other. An optimal reduced feature set would contain features from all three. To determine this group, they use the minimum redundancy maximum relevance algorithm. It selects features that share a high amount of information with the classification variable while low redundancy with other features in the set. To know how to stop an attack, you have to know who you're up against. The team's adversary model is focused on insider threats. Their example is someone who gains access to a coworker's computer with all the logins and information that a coworker would have. They will be aware of the gaze tracking system and will attempt to imitate the experienced user. They will be told either through instructions or will see a legitimate user operate the system. The user will not disable the eye tracking as that will instantly fail that user. In their experiment, 30 subjects were chosen, 20 being male, 10 being female, with 2 wearing glasses and 9 wearing contacts. They used an SMI Red 500 gaze tracker with a 500 Hz sampling rate. They viewed the computer from a distance of 50 centimeters. And before every test, they calibrated the gaze tracker to within 1 degree horizontally or vertically before they rejected it. And after each session, the calibration would be checked. One sitting of a test subject is referred to as a session. 2 weeks after the first session, subjects will be brought in for another. This is to make sure that results are consistent over time. Also, a third session will be an hour after the second to ensure that the results are consistent in the same day as well as over time. Each session will consist of 3 separate experiments. Each experiment will have a similar structure and contain a long and a short version. The subject will have a gray screen and a red dot with a white center that will appear randomly on the screen. The user will be asked to click on it as fast as possible. All instructions are given before the experiment begins. In Experiment 1, subjects are given nothing regarding the experiment. This is to model an attacker who attempts to gain access to a coworker's computer with no prior knowledge and attempts to access restricted content. This can also highlight differences in task completion time between the attacker and a normal worker, as natural learning will occur over time with the dot pattern repetitions. In Test 2, the subjects are given a textual description of where the dots will appear on the screen. The screen is divided in 6 areas numbered 1 through 6 that will correspond to areas on the screen. This is modeling a trusting, unwitting, or collaborating worker that provides knowledge to the attacker, but it is rarely as useful as on-system experience. They give the subject as much time to memorize the positions as needed. It is repeated 3 times with 5 different 5-dot sequences and 3 times with 7-dot sequences. Experiment 3 is attempting to mimic the possibility of a shoulder surfing attack by providing the subjects with a visual representation of the exact positions before a dot sequence is shown. Shoulder surfing is defined as looking over an unsuspecting person to gain knowledge of a system or gain passwords. In order to validate the results of the experiment, 3 metrics are used: task completion time, or the time it takes to complete a sequence of the experiment; gaze distance, or the distance between the subject's eyes and the position of the dot before it comes on the screen; and the cursor distance, which is where your mouse is before the dot is shown. As the number of repetitions go up, the quicker subjects move through the task, learning as an attacker would. To keep the results accurate over time, certain factors needed to be included to show the stability of results. First, they considered the brightness of the screen, and changes in the time of the day were accounted for. Second, pupils can change depending on drowsiness or exhaustion or stress or euphoria. And thirdly, technical artifacts are artifacts that the duration and number of fixation saccades can depend on the gaze tracker's precision and the fraction of missing samples. These can manifest themselves within the same session over longer periods of time, such as days or weeks. These are especially prevalent using data collected from multiple sessions. The classifier dataset is rich enough to reduce the influence of these error sources. By including data from several sessions, they are able to account for long-term and short-term feature decay. After training the data and generating a template for each user, they continuously decide whether a new sample belongs to a logged-in user. This can be based on a single sample or multiple. Multiple examples are more accurate but add a delay to the authentication process. The system is parameterized through this number of samples n and the threshold t, which defines how many of these samples must support the current user. If you look at the screen, this is the algorithm that they use. In order to ensure the statistical robustness of the dataset, it was split between training and test sets using a 5-fold stratified cross-validation. This results in 80% of the data being used for training and 20% for testing. All data, including the second and third session, forms the inter-session dataset, while the first and second are combined for the intra-session dataset. They consider all of the subjects as potential imposters of the other subjects. This reflects an insider threat scenario where coworkers could be a potential attacker. The equal error rate EER and maximal and minimal Dmax and Dmin class distances are used as performance metrics. The EER is the rate at which false acceptance rate and false rejection rate are equal. The class distance measures the distance between the user templates of a user and the most successful out of the 29 imposters, and gives insight about the distribution of false classifications. They arrive at this distance using the equation shown on the screen. A class distance of lower than 1 means that the best attacker is more likely to be accepted than a legitimate user. A higher class distance means that the user is harder to impersonate. The trade-off between false rejection rate and false acceptance rate is an integer, and report the average of FAR and FRR for the value of t which they are closest. The support vector machine outperforms the k-nearest neighbors classifier for almost every combination of features and dataset. While the training phase is slower for the support vector machine, the classification for a new sample is almost instantaneous. The best performance is achieved with intra-session data. The EER increase is from 3.98 to 6.05% when using inter-session data. This degradation is caused by technical artifacts across 2 sessions. The performance drops another 7.37% when considering data collected over 2 weeks. The fact that the EER is good but the minimal class distance is low suggests that the classifier performs well, but the templates of a few users are too similar to allow for reliable distinction. In order to mitigate this, it would be possible to determine the closeness of templates after training and give users whose templates are too similar an alternative security mechanism. A reduced feature set increases error rates significantly. Features that carry little weight on their own help form a more complete picture of the classification. This suggests that if an attacker attempts to mimic a few distinct features, it will not be sufficient given a complex feature set. The distinctiveness of the pupil diameter has a significant impact when removed on performance metrics. The error rate changes caused by increasing time distance is less pronounced for this feature set. A lot of degradation observed using the full feature set was caused by changes in the pupil diameter set due to this. Their classifier, in conjunction with the algorithm, makes continuous authentication possible. However, it is imperfect. EER is a good measure to compare classifiers, although it is rarely useful in the real world. The false rejection rate should be much lower to avoid false positives. The ROC curve shown shows that a false rejection rate of 0 is possible when using a full feature set, and a false acceptance rate of 19.2% must be taken into account. While that is high, it will be authenticating users continuously. A higher false rejection rate may be more acceptable in a higher security setting. Another parameter that impacts the detection speed is the number of samples used for the authentication decision. Increasing the samples to 40 decreases the EER, and after that is the point of diminishing returns. If quick detection of an imposter is important, the smallest number that yields acceptable error rates should be chosen. It is noteworthy that their study provides a much higher and more constant sampling rate than those that rely on active user behavior. The highest number of 180 samples will correspond to only 45 seconds. The figure shown shows that most attackers can be detected even before the 45-second mark, as the number of attacker samples in the sliding windows increase. 92% are detected within 40 seconds, 2.76% of attackers are never detected. These occur when biometric templates are very close, and as previously discussed, a second biometric could be the solution to this problem. In conclusion, the features discovered by this team are useful in a wide variety of tasks, such as web browsing or writing emails. This experiment accounts for various ways that a lunchtime attacker can breach security protocols, such as shoulder surfing or an unwitting coworker. The data had an error rate of 4%, coming from a subject pool of 30 people from the general population with the same exact equipment. This performance is consistent between experiments over 2 weeks apart, which indicates that users can be authenticated reliably over time. This experiment and research has implications in security going forward, as now we know that it can be a baseline for future experiments and that eye biometrics are now a possibility.